Okay, so just disclaimers at the beginning. No one here is affiliated with the FDA, as far as I know, and the co-hosts, Christy and I, are here to learn just as much as anyone. So we're not like going to be teaching anyone how, all about the FDA. It's going to be an open discussion. These are the questions we're going to go through, and I'll just start on the first one. I'm hoping we can take about 5 to 10-ish minutes on this. What is the FDA's definition of real-world evidence? And how does that differ from traditional clinical trial data? I have some answers on that, but I'm curious to hear if anyone has sort of, what you'd think.
I haven't looked at anything that's in print from the FDA, but kind of look at clinical trial data, whatever the experimental protocol, typically if it's randomized clinical trials, as almost lag data because of the time and cycle that it takes to set that up and get results. Real world evidence would be stuff that can evolve out of, I guess, current live systems that may not have in the science world the fidelity of randomized clinical trials, but you can still get directional information and good information about sort of what's happening now, particularly in fluid situations like COVID or whatever. That's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, I think that I think really still the people perceive real world evidence to be that which is derived from the electronic medical record. I think that's sort of considered to be the, kind of the holy grail of real world evidence, but, anything from like wearables, even, FDA does give a nod to social media data as also a source. So.
A definition that I read breaks down real world evidence and real world data a little bit. So real world data would be specifically data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of care that's really routinely collected from a variety of different sources. So it's the actual data. And then real world evidence is the clinical evidence about the usage or potential benefits or risks of a medical product that's derived from the analysis of real world data. So there are kind of two aspects to it. There's the data itself with all the issues that come with data, and then there's the analysis of that data, which becomes evidence, I guess. And then thinking about how it differs from a clinical trial, some of the things that the FDA points out in their documentation is that typically clinical trials are defined as a research study with where human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related outcomes. And the typical characteristics would include that it's supported by a research infrastructure that's separate or largely separate from routine clinical practice. It's designed to control variability and maximize data validity. There are often stricter eligibility criteria that ensure that your population has, the disease of interest or whatever. Usually they're randomized and usually they're double-blind. And they often follow specific protocols. So those are some typical characteristics of clinical trial data that might not be shared with real world data collection and real world evidence generation. Is that any thoughts on?
Yeah, I think also, so just for clinical trial is always very tight control. The people you get, it's very similar. You want homogeneous population so that you can really identify or have a good control for that. And then for real world, like you said, it's not, there's not designated principal investigator. It is, you get your data from different sources, and the setting is in the real world setting, because a patient may not, only have this treatment before they take the medication. They could have a variety of different medication, different race, ethnicity could all come into play when it comes to effectiveness. So I think for randomized trial, the purpose of that is to assess efficacy, and for real world evidence to really see like effectiveness of that medication or that device, how it works in the real world.
Another difference that comes to mind is just the notion, based on the things people have mentioned about whether a clinical trial can scale to settings that start to move outside the particular controls and bounds and protocols that you all have mentioned. And I look at real world evidence, like we were trying to look and see if dexamethasone decreased mortality or length of stay back in the early days of COVID. We didn't have to worry about that as a concept with scale. We were just doing it from the information in our EMR. You're going to kind of get an answer. You can do some things statistically to try to set up treated versus non-treated groups, and do those examinations and comparisons. And there's some knowledge and insights there, I think, despite it not being a formal study, set up with the strictness that goes around the randomized prospective trials. We needed to know. We couldn't wait 2 years for some look back, was like, is given this stuff meaningful or not? And we felt like we, were able to answer that question. So it's an example. COVID, like they said, was the use case to beat all use cases to drive people to do a lot of other things that we weren't doing, very fast in a healthcare and with our EMR data. But that's one example of what we did.
That's a perfect segue, if you all are okay with transitioning to the next question. Because I think that, that's a great sort of example of to think about as we're thinking about what are the benefits and limitations of using real world evidence to support regulatory decision making for medical products. Maybe we could start on benefits. Anyone? I mean, what are some benefits that kind of you've seen of using real world data?
I mean, I think that, especially once a drug is approved, and I would love to see more sort of, compassionate use, sort of that model being used to, once a drug is deemed like safe and having some signal of efficacy for population, putting that decision to try that drug in the hands of the patients and their clinician, and then obligate them to collect data, and then use that data to ultimately expand the label. If you look at something like, pitolisant is a drug that's been approved for narcolepsy and Prader-Willi syndrome. They're now doing a clinical trial it's approved for narcolepsy. They're now doing a trial in Prader-Willi syndrome, but now there are all of these neurodevelopmental disorders that sort of seem to have similar symptoms. And, there's never, the company will never be able to add all of those indications to the label. And there's no way to really demonstrate some like underlying molecular etiology that they have in common. So I would just love to see more of this, obligation to collect data in a sort of compassionate use type, setting, to expand the, access of drugs beyond at least the first indication.
Yeah, I think a lot of this real world evidence are used in rare disease, pediatric studies, because it's urgent medical need, and there's just sometimes an unethical to have a control arm when you're designing a study. So I think that will come beneficial to patients as well as for the developers, because then for rare disease, I know it costs a lot to enroll patients and to track them down. So yeah, I think that will be a big advantage of using real world data in this specific examples.
I think for me and for us, this concept of, whether the source data is shovel ready, so to speak, something that exists that can be gone after and sourced and aggregated fairly readily. I've been supporting a clinical institute for women and infants at Common Spirit Health, and following when we were large when we were Dignity Health. We had 26 OB sites, different hospitals that have obstetric services, and 60,000 annual deliveries. After we merged with Catholic Health Initiatives, we had 68 OB sites and about 95 to 100,000 deliveries. So whether you need a large N sample size for something that's common or commoner like maternal hypertension, or something that's less common like neonatal sepsis or whatever, the benefit, Tim, would be that you don't have to, it would take a Herculean effort IRB wise to set up a 68 obstetric site study to do a randomized clinical trial on, to be able to embrace that scope of patients and the like. But I guess as long as we can kind of pass muster that what we're looking after, say for maternal hypertension, is for quality or process or business improvement, which it is. We want to try to figure out who to treat, how to treat better, and outcomes and the like. Skip past that IRB process, you've got more patients in a disease cohort than anyone could ever round up in that time span. And if you've seen some of this stuff done, particularly people that write CCL queries in Cerner or SQL like queries in Epic, they can show you information on tens of thousands of patients in about 20 or 30 seconds, and you can ask additional questions and they can bring in other attributes from the EMR. So that's kind of what came to mind with the first part of this question.
Yeah, to piggyback off that, again, so my daughter has Prader-Willi syndrome, which I didn't say at the beginning. She was sort of the inspiration for Trend. So I have a lot of sort of experience with that particular disease. So we're one of the fortunate few, one of the 5% to have an approved drug. Growth hormone was approved 22 years ago as a pediatric indication for growth in PWS. And there is a general consensus that it should be a lifelong therapy. So, in order to sort of retain the muscle mass, it's important to stay on growth hormone therapy. But because no one ever took the extra step to get it expanded to adults, it basically, once kids, transition into adulthood, they can't get it covered by their insurance. And so, that's another case where it would be wonderful to be able to take real world evidence, because the truth is they're all staying on growth hormone, and clinicians are even getting creative and using other diagnoses in order to keep them on growth hormone. So it's so silly, right? They're getting it anyway, and they're finding ways to get it covered by insurance. But one, we're sort of polluting the real world evidence because people are twisting themselves into pretzels trying to make the case that this person should continue to stay on growth hormone. And, simply because it was, it's great. It was approved as a pediatric indication, but no one ever took it across the finish line for adults. And if anyone would like to tackle that problem with me, please call me.
My stepson has autism, and Tim, you may have been around enough to see there are some digital therapeutic solutions. I think one is by Achille Health. It's sort of a video game experience that helps to, I guess, train the brain plasticity for, to get past mind blindness and focus and the things that folks with autism need to make them, kind of allow them to fit in a little better in society. And we didn't do this, but it's imaginable that if Common Spirit wanted to try that, and we can identify via whatever discharge coding who has autism, particularly going into adulthood. There's a lot of focus on when they have kids, but nobody really knows, just like with ADD, what happens to you when you're 40. We could probably find some of those folks and do a thing where we, quote unquote, prescribe the Achilles solution and answer, for regulatory decision making for medical products. Once you get this out of the box from Achilles software solutions, where they say it helps, we could try to answer, does this really help? If we just kind of, pop the top on that and open it up and start using it, did we see for some outcome that's measurable, of course, or outcomes? We could do that with real world evidence. Clinical trial would be, it's just rougher to do that. It's a lot of work and sometimes money. And
well, it's a real world setting. I mean, that's like a perfect example of where it really requires a real world experience, right?
So it sounds like so far we've seen that real world evidence can be useful in providing some evidence for efficacy for treatments. It can also improve the efficiency of clinical trials, helping to find people to join those clinical trials, generating hypotheses for the clinical trials. And these are sort of more classic uses of real world evidence. Assembling geographically distributed research cohorts. So they're just particularly useful in rare diseases. Identifying prognostic indicators or patient baseline characteristics for enrichment or stratification. So these are some other sort of uses.
Sorry, just to jump in, but like Maria, your example of the medication, I was wondering, like, if the original drug, the drug has been approved probably long enough, they've probably lost all kind of incentives to expand. But if a similar situation, like a company, they have pediatric label and they want to expand to adulthood. Like when I went to the real world evidence meeting last year, and the Cardinal Health, they actually do something like this. It's like if a pharmaceutical company wants to expand labels, or they want to add more things, or just do pre-marketing search, they actually go to like EHR, like an organization that just have a lot of patient data, and they say they would pull it up for you. They can do a pre-screen because they just have so much EHR data, I guess. Yeah. And I wonder if a pharmaceutical can do that. Like if they go to something like that and say, hey, like how much is off-labeling use, in adult, and do you have enough data? And I think that would help pharmaceutical company to design their trials in a more effective way, because then they already know how much they can expect or things like that.
Yeah, so interesting. Like, just to sort of like, I thank you, first of all. I will check them out, but just then to kind of speak to the limitations. I was just asked, so a company is looking at claims data for PWS, and based on the claims data, there are only 6,800 patients in the US that have submitted claims to insurance. So and we would expect there to be, I think, around 15,000. So there's a gap. And so I would been asking around about, why would that be? Like, to me, it doesn't, you need a PWS diagnosis to get growth hormone, right? So what would be the scenarios in which like someone would be in the system but not have the code, the ICD-10 code? And part of it is for those adults, to your point, where they're not putting them in the system as PWS, but using a different diagnostic code so that they can get the growth hormone approved. So, you know, and it's like catch-22. I just learned this. We were just sort of like brainstorming this idea of how we can glean information from the medical record. And we were trying to understand why there wouldn't be more patients in the claims data, right? So anyway, I thought that was an interesting conundrum.
Yeah, like how you look at data source is definitely an important thing, because like how you collect data is one thing, and how you analyze data, like sometimes you don't apply the same criteria to the things you collect, and sometimes you miss. And there could also be like, yeah, just the data cleanness of how clean your data is as well, data management.
Once again, a perfect segue into the next question or topic here. So what types of real world data sources are acceptable for use in generating real world evidence? And what factors should be considered when evaluating the quality and reliability of these data sources?
I think the EHRs and then claims for insurance claims, I think those are two, like registries. Those are the ones I hear the most as sources.
Those have
and
been
probably wearables.
Traditionally used, haven't they?
Yeah.
FDA has a lot of experience with those. So it's like a lot easier for them to accept that kind of evidence because they already know what it is and how to work with it. So it's traditionally what it is, which I think is why they had this real world evidence program, because they wanted to try to push out beyond that.
So we're
building our business on this, right?
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, my response would be, our business is predicated on this and the use of social media data from Facebook, private Facebook groups and Reddit, and the use of an engine that's, leverages AI. So knowing that, we've had success, that's my answer to this, that, it is a credible source. I think the one important thing to add, and Maria always talks about this, and it's core to what we do, is we do this in an ethical way. We have an ethical framework that we abide by. We get consent. Like there's nothing, sneaky or anything going on. And I think that's a really important part that lends itself to the credibility that, we've been able to earn.
Yeah, no
how
data
do you
source is
do
perfect, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
were just talking about how the EMR may not be accurate always, right? Go ahead, sorry.
No, that's fine. I was just wondering, how do you do like patient privacy? Like, you're collecting all this personal data, but how do you approach?
Yes. So in the case of, as Lauren mentioned, Facebook groups, if we're talking about rare disease, often that's the only place that patients are talking about their experiences is in closed Facebook groups. And so for that data, it has to be anonymized. So we can't get user level information. It's aggregated and it's anonymized. And so we can get permission from the admins of the group. We do have a process for disclosing who we are and what we're doing and messaging that to the community. But as you know, like if you're in a group, you may or may not see that message. So because we can't get consent and we can only get permission, like consensus from the community and permission from the admins, we have to keep everything anonymized. But to give an example of where we've used that as real world evidence, or at least what I would sort of expand the definition to include would be, we made the connection using social listening between Prader-Willi syndrome and narcolepsy. So PWS is mostly identified as a disease that that experiences issues related to obesity and something called hyperphagia, which is a chronic insatiable hunger. So really all the clinical trials were focused on that. So we use social listening to try to broaden our understanding of the disease. And we found that parents were talking a lot about their kids faking falling asleep, sudden loss of balance, head bobbing while eating. And we partnered with pediatric neurologists who helped us to understand disordered sleep from a clinical perspective. And then we trained our engine to go through the data and quantify how much conversation might be related to narcolepsy and cataplexy. And then we were able to use that information to educate the community to say, your kid might not be faking it, it actually might be a thing. Then parents could take that data to their neurologist for a disease that's primarily treated by endocrine to say, I think my child might also have narcolepsy and it's not just them. Would you please do the daytime sleep study to check for narcolepsy? And then we were also able to use the data to inspire a pharma company who had just licensed a drug from Europe and brought it to market for narcolepsy to pursue PWS as a secondary indication. But because we didn't have good natural history on narcolepsy in PWS, because it wasn't on anyone's radar, we were able then to go to the FDA and say, okay, there's like a nod to it in literature. It wasn't completely missing, right? We had some data. And then we had this abundance of social media data to show that over the years, like people have been talking a lot about this faking these symptoms that likely were actually related to narcolepsy and cataplexy. And that was actually a really important piece of that of the drug company's application, IND application to initiate the phase 2 study. It's even more to it than that, but I mean, fundamentally, we were able to use that as a piece of that package.
Yeah, really cool. Because they probably wouldn't know any way to get this information without
this. Exactly. And now, but now it's like it's just a piece of the puzzle. I love to, when people say, now people don't say it anymore, which is wonderful, but like the plural of anecdotes isn't evidence, like those kinds of things. And, someone once said, observation is the first part of the scientific process, which I love. And it doesn't excuse you from doing the more rigorous data collection, and that, and we've set out to do that as well. Now you've got to fill in the gaps, right? You got to start collecting the natural history in a way that is that it will get that drug across the finish line when the day comes, right?
Yeah, for sure.
The EMRs, tell me if you need to move on, Tim, but there's
this is our last point. So you guys can take your time on this.
I'm sure you're all aware. I mean, there's structured and semi-structured data, and then there's the data in notes, which typically been dark data, unable to be seen. We've had some luck recently using the FHIR, Fast Health Interoperable Resources platform to query notes, where Common Spirit has 40% Epic, 30% Cerner, 20% Allscripts, and 10% Meditac. And we've done note sourcing from Cerner and Epic. We would do Allscripts and Meditac, but they haven't produced the FHIR API endpoints yet to allow us to source those. So that's on a path to getting, text to that concept that Maria mentioned about an engine that takes the text information and identifies things or whatever. We have been working with a company that has a good engine to roll things up so that you can start to use the concepts in the term space as structured data for information or predictive modeling. So that's one source of data that people, we typically haven't had access to, but we can now to look at things we need to look at for real world evidence. And then there are admission, discharge, and transfer ADT systems. Cerner notoriously didn't have a built product back in the day, so you had to go with Envision or something called was it MP4 or something, or MS4, an add-on product to see, discharge coding and when your patients were admitted, moved to a different unit, transferred to a different hospital, all those things. Epic has that built in. But that information is kind of EMR near in some instances where there's, another vendor solution. And then things like Midas and Premier that are quality systems that roll up information a lot of times out of the EMR and sometimes from different sources to look at various quality metrics. I would posit for the second question that if a health system's using something that's been in place fairly long-term and curated, that they think, measures quality within their health system, it's probably good to go for real world as real world data and as real world evidence to kind of look at outcomes in a quality sphere, whether it's patient harm or morbidity and mortality in various instances. Those are some of the systems that exist within the I guess the realm of the health systems. There's other stuff we are able to see in hospital deaths, but we can't see deaths outside of our system. And we looked at trying to go for state, death certificates as a measure to be able to further embrace, death within a certain time frame for some things in and around our palliative care effort. And that's very difficult to do, though. Once you get outside healthcare, the data systems are, a little bit like Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales, with a person riding around on a horse and filling out forms and, no rush to get it done. The person's dead. So if it takes 6 weeks to record the data, or longer, there's just no fire in the belly to have it, documented. And so it can get gnarly once you move outside. I would say as a final comment that for like our no-show effort, one of the predictors is your pay source. And we got challenged by somebody that was their bias baked in. And our response was, we're not using that information to then include or exclude patients being able to access and get an appointment. We're trying to identify folks that won't show up. And if the replacement patient, based on your demographics that you would put in that slot where we're predicting no-show, is self-pay, Medicare, Medicaid, whatever they are, that's fine. We're trying to increase patient access, all comers. So, a non-biased use of that information, even though it has predictive value for, reasons you might imagine, they don't have transportation, people that don't have, good finance sources behind. The other thing is this whole issue of race and ethnicity, which I don't think we do a very good job of, even when it's rolled up into white, Hispanic, non-Hispanic, and Pacific Islander with, common spirit. We've got Asian and Navajo populations and stuff across that geographic scope. And something about the phenotypic expression and what people list as race and ethnicity just doesn't quite cut it, in my opinion. I think we need to move back to a genetic profile. I think I read something where some gal's Ancestry.com showed 23 different race and ethnicities via her DNA. That's the kind of information we need to get at, because it's not, I don't know, I guess a cultural type of boxing or binning of what you are or who you are. It's something that could drive, if you have this DNA, you might have this syndrome or whatever at a higher percentage type thing. So that to me is a downside, that we're still at kind of a fledgling level on race and ethnicity with the things that we might tend to use for real world evidence in the short run to look at different cohorts across, the patient population.
You all have highlighted a number of the things that the FDA mentions in their documentation as far as like key factors to consider when they're evaluating the quality and reliability of data sources. Relevance is one. So you were just talking about how the, perhaps our culturally assigned, versions of race and ethnicity may not be as relevant to a medical question as perhaps like your DNA would be. And I think this is where things like wearables often fall down, that yes, they're collecting data continuously and they're really good at collecting that one little piece of data, but they don't collect any other data. And without any other data, it's like, hard to interpret that. And it's so collecting outcomes of interest that are like clinically valuable outcomes is really important. And then collecting the type of data that actually, has some cause or effect relationship with those outcomes is really important. So in thinking about relevance, and then data, when you think about reliability, they talk about promoting or having data standards that promote reliability. And so you mentioned FHIR. So it's this standard that helps with interoperability, so that the data that I'm transmitting from one healthcare system to another can be interpreted, when from many different sources. I guess you can interpret the same field in the same way across many different sources. So I know a potassium from here is the same thing as a K from there, or whatever. I don't know if that makes any sense, but and then data representation is another thing that came up. You'd mentioned, both groups, I think, actually, Trend and Common Spirit, are looking at their data and applying standardized terminologies, vocabularies, coding schemes to be able to understand, to take the way the language is naturally spoken and codify it into known clinical entities. So that's another sort of area that the FDA looks at to see if you're increasing the reliability of your data. And then having methods that can help you assess completeness, consistency, and trends over time in your data is important as well. And when I say trends over time, I mean like data quality monitoring. So monitoring for data drift and for data shift. So data drift, an example would be like, if your whole population has a BMI that is changing over time, that's drift in your data. So you want to understand, okay, that data has drifted. And does that mean that our population is now somehow different than they were before? And then shift would be examples where you have, like, in a certain field in your data, the data type changes, like from a number to a string, or maybe you have a data field that has categorical options, and now one of the categories has changed, or you've added a category or something. So that'd be another example of data shift. So these are things that, if you have processes in place that can monitor these over time, that can help to promote the sort of reliability of your data.
I think in the real world evidence conference, I can't remember which institution presented it, but they did a pilot project with FDA where they have taken the real, like, RCT randomized trial data, and she also come up with like a set of simulated data, and then trying to match them, and then just to see, like, how she analyzed the data and the data that's generated, whether it can actually match with what's already was done in clinical trials, which I thought was interesting, because I think
Talking about generative, right? Like,
yeah,
it's like amazing.
Synthetic data.
yeah, synthetic data, yeah. They tried to match it, and she was talking, it was a little more technical than my knowledge, but she was talking about something like, that they have to identify where the data was like not aligned, how they train, just to make sure that the tool they're using in real world evidence is not not biased, is not it actually aligns with what you see in a trial. Which, yeah, I just thought it was interesting, and how they come up with the things.
I mean, I know it's not really what we're talking about, but this idea, I think they call it like digital twins, like that whole I mean, I can imagine now that we have all of this generative AI, that sort of space is going to just like take off in the next decade, maybe 6 months. I don't know.
Yeah, but the attitude I got from FDA is they're very cautious. They wouldn't give any like, there are a lot of multiple, I guess, people asking like, is there like a data source you would just accept? And they wouldn't say there's one. Yeah, they said like they will have to evaluate each source. You present how you evaluate them. How the quality of your data. They're being very vague because I guess they don't. It's kind of new, and they're just still trying to play it out.
And that's part of the point of their program, I think, is that they want to try to expand beyond the traditional uses of the traditional sources of real world evidence, which you mentioned earlier, the EHR data, medical claims data, and registries, trying to expand beyond that. So like they don't want to like limit people's.
Yeah, they just want to pin down. Yeah, they don't want to pin down. They can be, I guess you can be creative, but you kind of be convincing to them while you're presenting. But people are getting so creative. Like mostly I think industry agree that this will still be most useful in a post-marketing surveillance, like safety and off-labeling use. They don't see it as going to be the main push for the approvals. But I do see like for rare disease companies, they are getting some success in that, like the BM,
Well, especially in gene therapy, right?
Yeah, gene therapy, rare disease oncology area. We've had like in the conference they presented a few successful cases that FDA was really actually trying to work with them to get approved when they don't have a control arm. Their control arm is like from real world evidence.
You reminded me of this quote that Scott Gottlieb, who is the FDA commissioner, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, said. He said that as the breadth and reliability of real world data increases, so do the opportunities, or sorry, real world evidence increases, so do the opportunities for the FDA to make use of this information. So I think it's kind of up to people like us who work with real world evidence and real world data to bring that reliability and to bring that breadth so that the FDA actually has, can use that information. Any other thoughts before I'm just going to kind of introduce the next session, which is going to be on April 12th. But before I go there, any other sort of thoughts or comments from the group?
I just wanted to encourage everyone to look at the FDA's approval of just trying to like Google it, because I know I'm like drawing a blank on the name of the company, the ALS drug. Oh my goodness. Talk about it all the time. Now I've like
maybe while you're working on that, any closing thoughts from the others, and then we'll circle back to you, Maria.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
What's
an A?
I didn't talk about it before, but I mean, to the extent that, and I guess it's part of that breadth concept, healthcare systems are not very good at streaming data solutions so far. So, even something as simple as the nightly information that comes out of CPAP machines, is not, to my knowledge, rounded up and curated and used in any fashion for, prediction or efficacy of the CPAP in certain comorbid states, whatever. I mean, there's not, there's not a portal in the EMR for that stuff to be streamed and appended or attributed to a patient. But the same thing would be true of the little Aura rings, you can wear, and any other device that you can think of. We still haven't put that together, but to the extent that it's done, then that foundational set of data in the EMR, allows you to kind of connect attribution wise, whatever biometric parameter that you're measuring with devices, steps, balance, accelerometry, all those things to bring in alongside other information knowledge elements. I think it's kind of exciting to consider. I mean, there's histopathology and all sorts of things now growing in terms of, it's no longer gram stains, there's immunologic markers on cells. I was telling folks at they had some vendors at the American Board of Artificial Intelligence and Medicine Summit that you nearly get this three-dimensional topology at a cell level of, when you start appending other attribute factors, some sort of stain color might be one of them, but there are 30 to 100 at least other factors depending on what's measured about that tissue that go on top of it. And it's literally like almost a topographic map about what's present where. And then you start throwing that at predictive modeling and other solutions that can accommodate that much data, to try to determine which drug worked best with that constellation of histopathologic markers. It really gets kind of mind-boggling how a lot of this stuff could be connected up. That to me is sort of the true digital instance, digital twin of a patient. It's not just, the first instance is the live patient. And then the question is, do you or can you instantiate meaningful, relevant things about them in a digital environment? We don't need to know probably every single little fact about a person, but we need to know enough, depending on what they have and what it is we're trying to predict over time. Longitudinal is also hard to bring together. But I think the forward world is very rich in terms of what, basically can be identified and appended to a patient for outcomes from taking a particular drug, or whether a particular drug in these patients like me types of scenarios would be plausibly, effective, or something that has a reasonable chance of success to be tried, particularly in rare disease states, perhaps.
Thank you. Christy, any closing thoughts from you? Christy?
Before you do that, I did find, just check out Amylyx Pharma. Billy Dunn spoke in the FDA, like the drug had previously been wasn't approved, and there was a second advisory board, and he basically made the case for using natural history comparison and open label data. So great example. And then also the recent approval of Reata's drug for Friedreich's ataxia, another one where real world evidence also played a pivotal role in the approval of those drugs.
So how do you spell the first one? The
AMYLYX. I don't know why I was having a hard time finding it too.
LMYL.
AMYLYX.
LYX.
I'm
Cool.
happy to share with you the recording of the advisory committee meeting where Billy Dunn gave that sort of intro and compelling argument, which I thought was interesting, being a member of the FDA.
Cool. Yeah, that'd be cool to
Yeah, that'd be great. Please do share. Awesome. Any other closing thoughts before we talk about what next session is going to be?
Nope, I think we're right on time.
Okay, so session 2, like I said, April 12th, it's going to be the same time of day. And today we were a little bit more heavy on the data, real world data side. This next session is going to think a little bit more about real world evidence. So we're thinking about study designs, what study designs are appropriate for generating real world evidence. How should data be analyzed and presented to ensure that it's meaningful and actionable for regulatory decision making? Then we're going to get into how does the FDA evaluate the quality and reliability of real world evidence. We were talking about data today. next time it's going to be evidence submitted by pharma and other stakeholders, and what are the potential implications for regulatory decision making. And then we're going to try to get a bit of a sense about where's the FDA going with this? How do they plan to continue to develop their real world evidence program? And what impact would that have on the pharma industry and other stakeholders? So thank you all for joining for this. Your input has just been incredible. I've learned a lot from all of you, so thank you very much. And I look forward to, hopefully you all can join again next week at the same time.
This is
Thank
great.
you.
Yeah, really great session. And I think we've got some people that we're working with pretty closely that should be interested in next week's topic. So we're going to try to recruit them for that.
Awesome.
We'll talk, Tim.
All right, sounds good.
Nice to
Thank
meet
you
you
all.
both. Sorry,
Nice
Maria
to
had
meet
to
you,
jump
Brian.
out to take another call like a
I'm
second
kind of
ago,
over
but
here. You can't
Jana
see
was
me.
listening too.